and I'm a professor of cultural and social analysis in the School of Humanities and Communication Arts. And together with my colleague, Kwa Yi-Ling, co-organizer of Radical Anti-Racism Today, I'm very pleased to invite you to the first seminar in the series. Today, I'm joining you from the unceded lands of the Gadigal-Wangal people of the Eora Nation. And I'd like, of course, to pay my respect to their elders past and present, and extend that respect to all their elders, to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here. Of course, whatever country we are on, these always were and always will be Aboriginal lands. Now, universities are built on sovereign Indigenous lands. Western Sydney University, our university, operates on the lands of the Darug, the Tharawal, the Eora, and the Wiradjuri nations. Universities have been and continue to be complicit with ongoing colonization and racial capitalism. So I acknowledge country as a settler and one whose existence in, but not of, both the land and the university, to echo CLR James, doesn't free me from responsibility for the violence enacted in my name. So with that in mind, in opening our seminar series, Radical Anti-Racism Today, New Books in Abolitionist, Anti-Colonial, Internationalist Anti-Racism, I can only quote Fred Moten and Stefano Harney, who write in the undercommons that one can only sneak into the university and steal what one can. So I'm very happy, therefore, that the Culture and Society Discipline Group, convened by my colleague Kwa Yi-Ling, has agreed to support this series of discussions, and that the School of Humanities and Communication Arts and the Institute for Culture and Society have also lent their support and assistance to this coming together. Now, the 6 seminars, I just want to take an opportunity to say a little bit more about the series before we start today's seminars. We're going to be holding them across the whole year, and they present new books, all of which make us think seriously and critically about some of the most pressing issues confronting us, including the carceral state and its role in making more people vulnerable to premature death, as one of our guests, Ruth Wilson Gilmore, has said so evocatively of the function of racism. Beyond these books' work of exposing the functions of race-making, they all emphasize action, not only to confront the violent forces of racial colonialism, but also to collectively dream of other worlds and to live and work as though they were already here, so as to thwart the numbing effects of pessimism that only serve to shore up the power against it. Now, before Yi-Ling introduces tonight's guests, let me briefly let you know a little bit more about the rest of the series, which you can see there up on the screen, although it's very small. Each event will put the invited authors in what we are sure are going to be generative conversations with local activists and scholars, because we believe that Australia presents a unique laboratory of race and coloniality, and that there's a lot to learn from these synergetic transnational conversations. So this semester, we've got 2 more seminars. The next one is on the 10th of May, and it's with Charisse Burden-Stelly and Jodie Dean, in conversation with Andrew Brooks. Then in June, we've got Mahdis Azarmandi and Garrick Cooper, who are going to talk about their book, Towards a Grammar of Race. So they're joining us from Aotearoa, New Zealand, and they're going to be in conversation with Yi-Ling. Then we take a break, and in the next semester, we're going to come back in September with Avia Day and Shanice Octavia McBean to talk about their book, Abolition Revolution, in conversation with Maria Giannakopoulos. And then the aforementioned seminar with Ruth Wilson Gilmore in conversation with Tabitha Lean about the wonderful book, Abolition Geography. And lastly, we're joined by Robin Maynard and Leanne Bitamusak Simpson to talk about rehearsals for living with Evelyn Aralowan. So I'm sure you'll be very excited, as I am, about the rest of the series. But of course, today I'm delighted that to kick us off, we have Michael Richmond and Alex Charnley, who've agreed to join us to discuss their meticulously researched and extremely well-argued book, Fractured: Race, Class, Gender, and the Hatred of Identity Politics. And I'm also delighted that Debbie Bargali, whose work on the racial contract as it operates against Indigenous people in Australia, who has added so much to the theorization of race here, has agreed to be in conversation with them for this first event. These are three people that I've been honored personally to be in solidarity with for a number of years now, and from whom I have learned so very much. So let me now turn to Yi-Ling to introduce the speakers and to say a little bit more. And of course, at the end, there'll be plenty of time for you to ask questions to our three speakers.
Thank you, Alana. Hi, everyone. My name is Yi-Ling. I'm really happy to be introducing our authors this evening. So this evening, we're really privileged to have the authors of this new book, as you can see on the slide, Fractured: Race, Class, Gender, and the Hatred of Identity Politics, by Michael Richmond and Alex Chanley. Michael Richmond was a co-editor of the Occupied Times and of Base publication. He has written for publications including Open Democracy, New Socialists, and Protocols. And Alex Chanley was illustrator and co-editor of the Occupied Times and of Base publication. We will put the link of this wonderful book in the chat in a short while, and please feel free to purchase a copy of the book. So the two authors of Fractured: Race, Class, Gender, and Hatred of Identity Politics will be in conversation with Associate Professor Debbie Bagali. She is a descendant of Kamilaroi and Wonnarawa peoples of New South Wales. She's the author of Unmasking the Racial Contract: Indigenous Voices on Racism in the Australian Public Service. And I have a copy of a wonderful book in my office. And we're really pleased and very privileged and honored to have the three of them to come together this evening to talk about this amazing book. So I hand over to Alex and Michael and Debbie as well.
Thank you for the introduction, and it's great to have you here today, Alex and Michael. So yes, my name's Deb Bagali. I'm a descendant of the Kamilaroi and Wonnarua nations in northwest New South Wales. I start by acknowledging that I'm on the unceded land of the Quandamooka people in Bayside, Brisbane in Queensland, Australia, and acknowledge elders past and present. I also acknowledge that Quandamooka country has always been a place of knowledge production and sharing. So the book Fractured discusses how identity politics has been used to dismiss movements such as Black Lives Matter and brought seemingly progressive people into the path of fascism. It argues that to get better worlds, we need to abandon the futile debates on identity politics. The authors move away from these ahistorical debates and argue that the interconnectedness of race, gender, and sexuality has always been inseparable from the history of class struggle under British and American capitalism. They closely unpack moments of revolution where seemingly divided factions have acted in solidarity. It gives a thorough account of Black feminist theorization of identity politics. The book helps us to understand how to imagine other ways of living and build effective solidarities. So Michael and Alex, let's get started. So I first read your book when it was gifted to me after it first came out by my good colleague and friend, Dr. Nilmani Fernando, who is a post-colonial and feminist Black scholar. She told me that it's a must read. So I did the whole skim read on my plane ride back to Brisbane thing, then was busting to get off the plane so I could use Dr. Google to search, who are these fellas? I'd not heard of you before, but you had researched so deeply and written so beautifully about Black feminisms in the UK and USA context. So because I consider positionality to be an essential element of critical scholarship, can you please tell us how you became interested in identity politics and came to write this book together?
Yeah, thanks for that, Debbie. It's really, it's an honor to be here as well to talk about this. Yeah, I suppose like just a little bit of history about us. I mean, we came together around the Occupy movement in the UK and London, centrally around 2011. I met Mike in a period where that was in its eviction, where a lot of the Occupy camps were being evicted. And we got to work together as part of the Occupy Times collective. There's a number of us there. up to about 10 probably, and kind of the numbers fluctuated, maybe more sometimes. But at that point, I think there was a question over what this publication, which was very centered as a social movement publication, a way of producing a circular around the Occupy movement. And after that movement had ended, I think it became a space, one, to reflect and critique some of the limitations of that cycle, movement of cycle, and how to attach to some of the situations in London and the social movements in London that were involved in forms of direct action and organizing around, say, anti-raids, around housing, and because, try to think about what kind of a publication can offer in those circumstances, because it's not that it's the publication itself is organizing anything, but how does it kind of present a proximity to these movements and become kind of, and think through really like what the next steps are. And really central to that and was the problem of capitalism, and it wasn't an easy problem. There was a lot of, like, we found in that movement a lot of reductive critiques of capitalism or conspiratorial critiques that we began to reflect on together. And I think, me and Mike in particular got close around some of the issues we did on madness and on mental health, and where we became engaged with a critique of the institution of power and how race operates through institutions and carceral settings. And so that was really how we kind of, in a way, it's kind of like being dragged up on the left, I suppose, in a certain period where actually, one of the advantages we had, that we were around lots of people who were talking about intersectional feminism, who were, kind of, well, for me personally, at least, like, putting me straight on certain things which were kind of out of like my understanding or my perspective. And through this deliberation, I suppose, in this collective, we became close. It became central to us to think about Britain and where we were, and Britain's relation to the world historically, and what that kind of meant, and how we critique capitalism and become involved in movements and build capacities up in those settings, that we have a framework to work on that's constructive. And that was kind of the beginning of that. And I think on a personal, it involved a lot of personal reflection at that point about our histories personally. And for me, I've had family members who've been incarcerated, and a family member who's very close. And it was at that point that I could begin, through Black radical tradition writing, Black feminist writing in particular, that this is where really I was exposed to what a critique of the carceral state and what this meant. That it wasn't kind of a moral stain, or it wasn't something that it had to repress or not talk about. This is where this issue is engaged as a structural one. So I think that in a way, this is like important to kind of foreground, really, is that a lot of that collective learning that came through this project started to present certain problems to us in our lives, and we began to repose those problems. So, and then I think around 2016, 17, at that point, just to keep it, move it on to maybe Mike to answer his section of this, but we then began Base, which is a second publication. And for us, really, to engage these problems was we had to do it historically. We had to kind of historically work through what we were in here. And we felt that was one thing that was really, really lacking from those early movements, was historical perspective. So that's kind of where, how we got together, didn't we, Mike? And we started to like formalize a writing relationship, I suppose, through that.
And I just wanted to ask, just before we ask Michael to, position himself, can you just briefly, for the Australian audience, explain the Occupy movement in the UK? What you're talking about?
Yeah. So it was a global movement, and it was instigated in the UK, in Europe, and the US, or kind of inspired by the movements around North Africa and a lot of those rebellions against kind of dictatorships in Egypt. And I think that it became what was kind of now understood as a movement of squares, where maybe a Western framed occupied movement kind of brought up in these different settings, and it was about occupying space in financial areas or financial settings or in ports, and a kind of direct action, a disruption that within it had radical elements, and within it also had a kind of conservative, conspiracist. It was a complex movement where naiveties as well. I think that there's a lot there really, and I think that certainly one of the things we wanted to do is just kind of reflect on that together about those limitations and come through it. And I think one of the major things about it, personally, I would say, around that time is that what wasn't central really to our understandings or the movement understands in that period was race and colonial and the colonial settings. So that's kind of a bit of context for that.
And Michael, what brought you into doing this work and writing this book?
Well, first, thanks to Alana and Eileen and to Debbie for speaking to us. I think, it's really difficult to sort of accurately try to describe one's kind of political trajectory or one's consciousness. I think, I don't want it to kind of be some kind of post hoc narrative about how like a couple of like white dudes sort of suddenly like wrote about and cared about these things. I think it's partly that I come from like a family of Jewish leftists that kind of ingrained certain things in me. Partly that I had like direct experience of being in kind of psychiatric settings, so like that experience of kind of state power can be something that kind of like opens one's eyes to certain things. But to be honest, I think mainly it was like just a kind of intellectual openness of the kind of the movements that we were kind of proximate to, and the fact that we were very online. We were part of these kind of Twitter kind of networks, which were engaged in like a lot of critique and information sharing around race and gender, and a lot of these kind of conflicts that were happening around intersectionality and kind of Black feminism and kind of trans exclusion and things like that. So these were just happening in our around us all the time, and I think that we were learning from those things.
Okay, thanks for that. The title Fractured is intriguing, as your book broadly studies and gives an account of how solidarities form in times of revolution, as well as how they diverge. In chapter 1, in your detailed discussion of the set of long different histories of identity politics, you introduced the concept of revolutionary time that you later engaged to tie this book together. Now, David Rodiker, who, by the way, is presented here in Australia previously through invitation of Professor Aileen Morton-Robinson, he refers to revolutionary time as a period in which the pace of change and the possibility of freedom accelerated the very experience of time. So can you tell us about the importance of centralising this concept, revolutionary time, in mapping the past to understand contemporary struggle?
Yeah, I think, we were reading a lot of David Rodiker's work, in particular his book Seizing Freedom, where he was sort of primarily focused on what W.B. Du Bois referred to as the general strike of the slaves, so the kind of uprising of around 500,000 enslaved people during the period of the US Civil War, which Du Bois and Rodiker both show was the kind of central kind of played the central agentive kind of role in that conflict and in the self-emancipation of over 4 million enslaved people. And we were really taken with Rodiker's kind of use of this this concept of revolutionary time in that context. Not that he didn't coin it. He says in the book that he kind of he borrows it from the kind of historiography of French Revolution, but it's a way of kind of trying to understand how during these periods of like upsurge in kind of social struggle of like people struggling against oppression and exploitation, that can have this kind of unfolding effect that ripples out towards different people's subjective formation, people's sense of themselves, sense of what's possible. I think we reference in the book that Frederick Douglass is he has to leave the United States to travel to Britain in, I think it's 1859 or 58, where he is he's accused of being in cahoots with John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry, when he actually had nothing to do with it, but the authorities were after him. And he's writing at the time on the boat to Britain that it feels like slavery is more entrenched than ever, and that he can't see the possibility of its overthrow. And within 2 or 3 years, you have this this huge kind of uprising and this kind of turning of things on its head. And so for us, that then kind of developed into a way of looking at histories of struggle, histories of revolution, and we developed it through the course of the book, where it began to kind of inform the way we were looking at different periods around the period of the First World War, and the kind of the fact that different struggles were kind of building on each other, borrowing from each other, struggles that were happening in parts of the world, and then we looked at things that were happening in terms of like the Black Power movement, Black feminism, women's liberation movements in the late 60s and early 70s, and how those were also kind of moments, periods, temporalities where people believed that new things were possible. And I think that was partly like what Alex was saying in terms of the movement where we met was, this was the period of the Arab Spring, where certain assumptions were being turned on their heads, and where people felt that like things were possible. So we've recognized, in our own, political lifetimes that these kind of these upsurges, like the global uprisings in 2020 after the murder of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, about how things were happening then that weeks before, if you told someone that several police stations in the United States would be on fire, then they wouldn't have believed it. But that's what these kind of social struggles that are often based on forms of struggle and forms of practice that were long part of different, like the struggles of different communities. So like the uprising in the general strike of the slaves is not something that comes out of nowhere, and it's not only opportunism, it's also building on literal centuries of kind of marinage and resistance in among enslaved people in different contexts throughout the New World. So I don't know if Alex has anything to add.
Not much, I don't think, but yeah, I mean, one of those issues that kind of comes up, especially with the global uprisings in 2020, is that when they die down, and I think that we spend a bit of time in the book at different parts looking at the reaction to that and the way, and one of the reactions is to say, well, there we go, it was a spontaneous uprising that didn't go anywhere, did it? And there's something like really shallow about that, and a kind of cynicism, I think, that's infused around individual critical authors, and an urgency to be critical, but in quite a shallow way, not to understand what the composition of these movements are and what their effect was, and also hold on to the experience of that revolutionary time, a period in which insurrection felt ordinary, and those moments, that like felt just and didn't feel like it needed a program, or wasn't programmed. That this is how these things have worked historically always, and they often can't be predicted, but like Mike said, there's reasons why these things come about, and we'll expect them to come about in the future. And we wanted to hold on to that because we felt that there was a sourness emerging on the left, but in some quarters that were almost prepared and wanted to have a kind of told you so moment, maybe, or really kind of reinforce. We were quite quiet over a period of insurrection and wanted to reinforce a narrative that this is a weak kind of political organizing. It's maybe a novel form, social media centered. It doesn't have the substance of the political traditions of the left. And all of these kind of canards, if you like. Do you know what I mean, Debbie? Like, it's that, it's what we wanted to push back on that, and through history try and kind of create a space to remember what these situations are, and that they're complex, and that they include conservative elements as part of them. And that, you know what I mean, there's nothing novel about that, but there's something we want to situate and find a way of writing around revolutionary time and moments, that we can kind of like get into the thickness of that, the density of it. So I suppose that's what we found with Roediger's use of it that was really appealing to us. That we didn't come in, we had it in our minds, but we didn't kind of come in, did we, Mike? Like, oh, we're gonna pick a few revolutions and work through them. I think that Mike did a lot of historical work and research, and we had hundreds of thousands of, like really deeply, insightfully kind of trying to work through these historical situations. But it was like we wanted to use that history in a non-instrumental way, but also in a way with a purpose to say a lot of these discourses are ahistorical, and that's their function. They're there to actually trivialize, and there is an intent there to trivialize movements in history. So so I think that's that's kind of our position on that.
And the extent of your research is really shines through in the book. I mean, I read it and I've gone, where these fellas find time to do all this research? So it was amazing.
Nighttime. Huh? Nighttime.
Nighttime, yeah. So in chapters 2 and 3, you discuss in more detail the origin and concept of identity politics. Identity politics, which was originally named by the Combahee River Collective, recognised the identity problem and made it a solidarity problem. Can you please talk about the origins and theoretical concepts of identity politics in Black feminism, and how these have been manipulated in the present?
I think the book began as we were writing an essay about kind of anti-wokeness on the left. So we started writing this essay in like 2016, 2017. So it was right when kind of a lot of people involved in kind of the Bernie Sanders movement and the Jeremy Corbyn movement were trying to kind of cohere their politics around these kind of electoral pushes and trying to compose themselves around electoralism rather than, there's different ways to compose movement. And part of the way that they were doing that was engaging in these kind of these quite kind of lazy ahistorical discourses about kind of dismissing identity politics or dismissing wokeness and saying like these are basically things that will get in the way of unity, and we have this opportunity and stop being weird, and these were the kinds of things that people were saying around that time, and so this was the kind of going to be the framework for our book, and then we were doing lots of research, as we said, because we wanted to ground it historically. And, you know, and part of that is about trying to kind of historicize the kind of terms that people are using, because if you just arrive in you know 2022, 2023, here, like seeing on the front of newspapers and blaring across social media that blames everything on wokeness or identity politics, it's easy for people to have absolutely no idea what any of that means, what people are talking about, and that's kind of, you know, it's part of the point. And we try to kind of trace those discourses historically, not to try and say like, oh, there was this original identity politics coined by the Combahee River Collective, it was good, and it went bad, you know, people ruined it, like, because that's the kind of position that some people take up. I think our position was to try to extend the history, to say, you know, the kinds of like intellectual work and organizing work that the Combahee River Collective were engaged in, and that Black feminists were engaged in Britain at the same time, was partly about the kind of specific positioning of Black women in kind of racial and gender divisions of labor. In Britain, it was more to do with you know, like migrant communities, and then in the United States, it was you know, legacies of slavery and super exploitation and Jim Crow. And so, you know, we were engaging with like longer histories of the writings and kind of organizing of Black women in the United States context, going back to the 19th century, and then coming up to people like Claudia Jones, who's writing things about the triple oppression in the 1940s. So these are kind of through lines of like theorizing and struggles that Black women were engaged in different contexts, that were coming up against these problems of exclusion or erasure within white women's movements, or from kind of black power movements, or Black kind of men's organizations that were not kind of sufficiently engaging with their own patriarchy. So these were about like these needs that Black women were finding through history to form their own autonomous groups, to kind of to kind of find their own ways to struggle, because they weren't being admitted, or their problems weren't being solved or even seen by the existing kind of struggles and organizations. And so, you know, what we're saying is that those problems are present. You know, not to say that things don't change, things change, but those problems remain present within any movements that want to try to bring social change. There are problems of identity, there are problems of how to compose movements, there are problems of how people can organize together, how solidarity can be formed, how solidarity breaks down. And we're trying to show that there is more continuity to this than there is this kind of new thing that kind of focuses just on like people's, you know, facile kind of engagement with social media, or that it's kind of that like a lot of people on the left will kind of put everything down to neoliberalism. This is about individualism and neoliberalism, and we're trying to say, no, look, this is a problem that can be stretched, where we can learn from some things that someone like Maria Stuart is writing in the 1830s in abolitionist newspapers. And she's saying, look, like, Black women are at the absolute bottom of the racial and gender division of labour, and no one seems to, like, none of the things that people are presenting as like the solution to this problem are going to engage with that. Alex, I don't know if you wanted to.
Yeah, that's right. And I suppose that problem of identity, that it's constituted around the state. I think some of the things that we kind of, through the research, we begin to focus around is that, how does whiteness as an identity constitute itself? Or change its form of appearance, from being, say, in the British context, a kind of aristocratic, relationship to the upper class. How in the late 19th century does it become a kind of a popular form of appearance of unities around, a racialized class of workers, of British workers, and border regimes, and how border regimes are organized and lobbied for by, to some extent, to a large extent, through representatives of organized labor. And that one of the issues of focusing really around labor and a labor organization, and what we'd understand is the left political tradition, is that the idea has been that those traditions being ruptured has produced this state of spontaneity and just identity movements that have no unity. And we were like, well, it's a completely facile argument, and it's historically inaccurate, and there's nowhere constructive to lead from it. I think that it can, part of that reaction, I think, is exasperation, which we all feel around division and being kind of exasperated. But for us, it's like, you work through division, and you see it historically in a longer light, and you can look at it again with fresh eyes. You look at stuff that was obvious, but it's been disregarded because you're trying to bracket off and find a kind of metaphysical unity, maybe in the air somewhere, or around a project, or a kind of something simple that can cohere. And so, I think historically the situation of identity isn't to do with any kind of movement. That's one of the splits that happens around the left in the 80s, really early 90s, that neoliberalism becomes periodized as a stage in capitalism in which identity politics becomes its democratic leverage, its way of incorporated movements. And all of us here know about the instrumentalization of identity, and what that does, and how that disregards grassroots, working class, indigenous, anti-racist movements that have long threads, and kind of trivializes that. But I think the reaction to identity politics in the pop is to kind of use that instrumentalization and say that's what it is. That's this substance of anybody who organizes around these issues, and that's an incredibly dangerous thing. And it's got a lot of purchase over the left since we've kind of been dragged up around this stuff. And so historically, when we're talking about the problem of identity, we look at labor movements and the problem of labor identity. We look at how labor movements had to, as Mike was saying, and Claudia Jones very early on in the 1940s is looking at it and saying, look, labor is being differentiated by race. There's labor difference. If you're going to organize class struggle, you need to kind of like get to grips with that and engage how that labor has been colonially differentiated. And global movements and colonial and settler colonial projects of the state have produced this differentiation, and there's no way to move forward unless that's kind of recognized. So
So what I found interested in your discussion, particularly around the manipulation of language, and as we know, this silences, and how this silences racialized class and gender groups, and how this manipulation serves to control who can speak about what. And I made a note to say, and let's face it, we know that this silencing and control of who can speak and what cannot be spoken about can come from people from the right or the left, negatively racialized or not. So I think that's important to note. I'm conscious of our time, so there's a couple of more things we want to get through. In your concluding chapter on page 211, you make the point that whiteness cannot be placated or made progressive. It must be abolished through collective action. And I couldn't agree more. However, as the late philosopher Charles Mills makes clear in The Racial Contract, most people benefiting from whiteness, regardless of whether they are white or not, don't see a benefit for them in abolishing whiteness and necessarily giving up the wages of whiteness, as Du Bois and Rodiga refer. So what are your thoughts briefly on the ways that solidarities can be built in this moment? Because as we know, the conservative reaction and backlash to anti-racism movements is real, and the view is that anti-racism causes racism.
Well, I think, one of the things we're trying in the book is first, like, register that whiteness exists. I mean, there's a lot of denial that it does. It's kind of if whiteness exists, then what are its forms of appearance, and how are they historically different in different contexts? The context of Australia and Britain and the UK, what are these differences? How does history of colonialism in these settings produce forms of whiteness that can share and borrow, but have their own kind of history and specificity? So the first thing for us with the book is just to register that, because in a sense, I think, again, the concept of whiteness gets worn out because it becomes instrumentalized. So you get certain publishing cultures around whiteness being an individual confession, or a kind of the way to kind of rid yourself of this stain of whiteness is to, kind of put the effort into consciously, kind of removing your bias. So it's kind of an individualized relationship to that concept that distorts many of the historical readings that we are trying to contribute to, which is that this is a structure and it's analyzable. You can analyze it. It happens in places. It produces whole political context, and it actually creates ruptures within class struggles. So that's the first thing for the book to do. I mean, how solidarities develop practically around that, well, it's very difficult. It's a whole project of the state and the media to create a situation in which whiteness can only be spoken of as a kind of form of stain, or a way of kind of almost like creating an idea that whole citizenry, anyone that lives in Britain or Australia, you'll be trying to be made guilty by anti-racists, and that's the project they're on. You know what I mean? And we've got to accept that and kind of build a different one, build an alternative way of organizing, a way of educating ourselves around these histories, and working out what is strategically important about that.
Excellent.
What do you think, Mike?
Yeah, I think that if we were talking about the most recent kind of like period of revolutionary time that we were referencing, it would have to be what happened in 2020, and you see that in that kind of, we register that in the book as just one of many uprisings historically that have emerged through the agency of Black struggle, which then kind of begins to kind of cascade through other movements. So other movements begin to form their own struggle, their own subjectivities around, like through either being in solidarity with Black uprisings, or just kind of viewing them and in some cases appropriating them for their own ends. But that's certainly something that we found to be patterned through our kind of explorations of like what happened in the 1860s and what happened in the 1960s. But part of what's happening in 2020 is that like lots of like white people racialized as white in small towns in Britain and America suddenly were engaging in like furious insurrection against the police. You had towns like Portland, which were in open revolt for over 6 months. You had people who did not have a background in radical politics becoming interested in colonialism and in histories that they weren't taught in school. So like this is not an answer to everything, and Alex is completely right in terms of like these are a part of like sort of slow build movements, the kind of things that you know, people are involved in, like underfunded and under kind of appreciated forms of organizing and struggle for decades around things like prison abolition or deaths in custody or people in immigration detention and things like that. And then you get these upsurges which can bring more people in and hopefully can strengthen those movements. Not always, but can. But those are openings which do provide kind of possibility, and it's not just about kind of getting people to think about things and getting people to kind of give money to things or get involved in activism. It's about the fact that in the very moment of insurrection, you had huge numbers of white people seeing their own freedom being connected to these insurrectionary forces that have been that are continually produced by police murders of black people. So that's I think something that maybe, you know, it's not always just about kind of trying to kind of build coalition, like rainbow coalitions of like fixed groups. It's also about kind of seeing in practice that like people actually come together and do stuff because they see that is what gets them free as well.
Okay, I just wanted to sort of like, you know, we're cutting through time now, so I just want to get to us so we can have a brief conversation around, you know, what you talk about in your book around Black agency, and also the way that sort of like comes through in Australia. And like what I found also in your book that resonated me, both personally and also in the research that I do about Indigenous people and work, is your discussions on trade union movements. I grew up in Wollongong on the south coast of New South Wales, in a large steel and metal manufacturing and coal mining region. My dad, an Aboriginal Australian man, started out in Wollongong as a steel worker, and when retrenched in the credit squeeze, what they was called the credit squeeze back in 1961, he was retrenched, and he walked the pavements of Wollongong looking for work and ended up becoming a coal miner and a strong unionist for the next 30 years until he retired. So I spent my childhood and early teenage years in the 1970s and 80s chanting up and down Crown Street, Wollongong, and on the steps of Old Parliament House in Canberra at union marches with other coal miners and their families. At the time, union movements did not appear to be fractured by race or indigeneity, but were mobilised collectively around workers' rights and their conditions. But most of the steel workers were Southern and Eastern European migrants from post-World War II migration from, you know, the former Yugoslavia, Italy, Malta, Spain, Portugal, Greece, Germany, and Poland, along with British and Irish migrants. There was limited work for women, and particularly migrant women, who ended up in the garment factories and the tin mill sorting rooms. And, you know, my non-Indigenous mum of Irish descent also was working in those tin mills and steelworks up until I was born. But as you say, the working class has always been divided, though it might not have appeared to be the case. We rarely see unions mobilising independently in the streets today, fighting for workers' rights, regardless of the fact that we have here in Australia ongoing racial divisions of labour, particularly for Indigenous Australian peoples who are mostly contained on the lower rungs of the employment ladder. Most movements around race on the street have been led here in Australia by Indigenous peoples For example, the Black Lives Matter movement was led by Indigenous Australian women. We also see Indigenous solidarity with Palestinians against the settler colonisation and support for, refugees against refugee detention. So you discuss solidarity building mechanisms and Black agency in the book. And one example that comes to mind to me here in the Australian context is what we call the Gurindji Walk-Off of August 1966. This was a symbolic event in Australia and brought wider attention to the Australian public about the impoverished conditions of Aboriginal pastoral workers and to the Aboriginal land rights movement. With limited bargaining power, Aboriginal workers had conveniently slipped through the safety net made available to other workers through legislations at that time. So the Gurindji workers of the Northern Territory, especially the elders, were well aware of the poor conditions of their people and the exploitation of their labour with unequal wages when the Gurindji elder and head stockman Vincent Lingari led about 200 Aboriginal stockmen and domestic workers and walked off their jobs at Wave Hill Cattle Station. The station owners, Vesti Brothers, the largest meat retailer in the world at the time, had refused to pay the Aboriginal workers' wages. But the walk-off was not only about wages and poor conditions, it was about self-determination and the desire to live on their own land and control their own lives. The walk-off was also about the white men's sexual monopolisation and abuse of Aboriginal women. The focus being on equal wages was used strategically because wages were the language with which white Australia could understand and constituted an issue which trade unions were known to support. The Gurindji were focused on reclaiming their land while the unionists believed the dispute was solely about wages and work conditions. After 8 months of failed negotiations, on April 1967, the Gurindji workers moved camp about 20 kilometres away to Dagaragu or Waddy Creek. They campaigned for 7 years for a small portion of their land to be returned, and they were successful around 1973-74. In September 2020, the Gurindji claim for native title to Wave Hill Station was granted. That is 54 years after the walk-off. So Australian people today mostly know of the Gurindji walk-off through the protest song From Little Things, Big Things Grow by Paul Kelly and Kev Carmody. The campaign drew on support from unions, church organisations, the anti-apartheid movement and political parties such as the Communist Party of Australia, Socialist Party of Australia and some elements of the Australian Labor Party. But those ways of working today become problematic because of the uncritical uses and misuses of identity politics. So I'd offered up this example because narratives of Indigenous Australian resistance and agency and Indigenous Australian scholarship is rarely used in US and UK scholarship, yet we have a lot to contribute to the global canon of knowledge about Indigenous peoples or on the settler colonial or racial colonial societies, and in particular, identity politics. So one such example is Indigenous Australian sociologist Professor Bronwyn Coulson's award-winning book titled The Politics of Identity, Who Counts as Aboriginal Today? Actually, it's here on my pile, this book here. Everyone can see it. So the book demonstrates how the politics of identity is used as a settler colonial tool towards the logic of elimination. What it does is shows how previous and contemporary governments wield ideas about who and what counts as being an Aboriginal person. For example, the three-pronged definition of that is used by government to identify us, and we're expected to use blood quantums, measures, and so forth. It concludes by asking, what can we achieve in our relations with the wider nation state if we are not so preoccupied in our own communities with regulating and surveilling each other for a few crumbs thrown under the master's table? You finish your book by honouring who you describe as one of the most dangerously underread thinkers and writers of anti-racism movement, the late Sri Lankan British scholar activist Ambalavana Sivanandan. Everybody in Australia, otherwise known as Siva, everybody in Australia would benefit greatly by reading and engaging Sivanandan's work on anti-racism. I agree with you that his legacies are important and invaluable. But I'd like to finish off what I'm talking about here, with a quote from your writing on page 216 in Fractured. You write, reduced to culture, identity becomes personalised rather than being an expression of class composition and the outcomes of struggle. We reject the reduction of identity to culture. The culture is white supremacy. So, Michael and Alex, over to you.
Yeah, when you told us about this, Deb, at the Grungy walkout, and I think that that's precisely what we're interested in around the book, is that what is a labor struggle, or its form of appearance is a labor struggle, but actually it's a struggle for self-determination. And within that, you get a whole insight into relations of production as well. You know, you get an insight into, like you say, the biggest exporter of meat at the time, and state tenancy of land to capitalists and how that's operating in Australia. So often these kind of these things are kind of separated it out. And what we mean when in that quote, when we talk about culture, we're talking about a very reductive, abstracted notion of culture that kind of operates in the same way that anything that's related to indigeneity, race, gender, in a public sphere, in the national public sphere, is reduced to a cultural war. You know, this is a cultural war thing. And then there's material things. Do you know what I mean? These divisions, well, for us, these divisions operate in left theory too. And it became quite structural. So you get class and identity being polarized. You get class and culture, or, being polarized. Class and race being polarized. And whenever you get into the grain of it, of a labor situation, no one's talking about that. They're looking at the context of it, and it's cut through with the colonial setting. It's cut through, as you talked about, with monopolization of kind of power over women by capitalists, especially in these kind of settings. So I think that it's an example that I'm certainly, when you spoke about it to me, I'm really interested to look into, because I think that part of having these conversations are bridging these international divides. We don't feature Australia within the context of the UK, and the US has this saying because we didn't know enough. We were beginning in Britain that we understand the relationship. And I think having these kind of conversations is a way for us to kind of deepen our research into how these differences surface, so yeah, I mean, that's it, isn't it, Mike? Really, that's what we wanted to get into with the book, really, is that what we get, reason why we focus on Black feminist analysis is that we get analysis of forms of oppression, relations of exploitation, relations of production that are specific, that are constructive, that help anyone analyze what the capitalist world is and its differences. So
I was just going to say, I find it almost ironic that, British scholarship doesn't engage our scholarship in these matters, considering it was the British that created the racial state.
Yeah.
The racial contract. So look, it's been fantastic talking to you, Michael and Alex. Michael, did you want to add anything to that?
No, I'm happy to open it to questions if anyone has them.
Okay, so we might hand it over to whoever's managing the questions here, or
Thanks,
what's
Debbie.
going on.
Yes, that would be me. Thank you very much to all three of you for what I think has been a really, really rich conversation. Although I've read the book twice, and I've been honored to be able to have another conversation with Mike and Alex about the book on a podcast we did at the end of last year, and of course ongoing conversations with all three of you. I always learn so much from listening to you, and I'm sure our audience has also. So we have about half an hour left for questions. You are either welcome to type them in the chat and I will moderate, or you can, of course, use the raise hand function, which is in the little button underneath that says reactions, and I will do my best to call on you to ask your question aloud if you prefer to do that. It's always daunting to be the first one. Oh yes, I've got a question here from Sam Schultz. So I'll read out your question, Samantha, if that's okay with you. She says, amidst such a torrent of knowledge production via multiple platforms nowadays, I'd love to hear what the author's thoughts are on publishing, broadly speaking, but also in terms of publishing as resistance or refusal. Perhaps the fact that they've co-published is salient here. That's a great question. Who would like to respond?
Do you want to go
and
on
while
that,
you're responding, we'll gather some others, hopefully.
How much should I divulge? Yeah, well, like, you know, Debbie said in her first question that she'd never heard of us fellas, and there's good reason for that, because we've not really done anything. So this is our first book, and it's been a real experience to kind of suddenly kind of emerge into this world, and yeah, I think we've definitely kind of come up against what we find to be some of the issues, you know, particularly with left publishing. But my wife is also a writer. She writes young adult fiction, and so I get some insight into publishing more generally. I think, you know, some of our issues have been more kind of individualized in terms of like just the lack of resources that there are. I just think, you know, in left publishing, but probably in publishing more general, there's almost no, or certainly wasn't much resource put into kind of publicity and things like that, and that's like a difficult thing for kind of a lot of publishers, and it's been difficult for us to try to get the book out there. Like we felt like the book, we tried to make the writing accessible, even though we know we are part of kind of left cultures that sometimes have our own kind of jargons and languages, and that can put some people off. But like we tried to make it accessible, and we felt that it could be something that you know, that because it speaks to an issue that is so present in the mainstream in terms of the amount that people talk about wokeness and identity politics, that we felt like, you know, that there was the possibility to kind of project the book kind of beyond you know, the British left, but it's hard to know how much that has happened or not. I mean, it doesn't feel that way, but that would present its own problems. I can't imagine us going and having a conversation on the BBC or something. In terms of publishing otherwise, I mean, you know, I don't know whether we've talked about kind of alternatives to kind of going with established presses. Like if we were to do another project, we floated the idea with each other of trying to go a different way, but there doesn't seem to be any kind of alternative model that feels particularly ideal. Everyone seems to have a podcast nowadays, so maybe that's the answer. But that takes some know-how as well. I don't know, Alex, what do you think?
Yeah, I think it's the kind of book it is as well, and this is intended. And you know, what we really needed, didn't we, Mike? We needed an editor. When the first draft of this that we thought was a book wasn't quite a book, really. We found out pretty quickly when we spoke to Nada, who became our editor, and what she gave us really is an understanding of like what a book looks like, and you know, like work with us in this way, and helped us develop an argument through historical text, which isn't, I would say, it's not necessarily this punchy title. You know, when you're working with a lot of history like that, you're going through lots of avenues. I said at the end when I read it through, the last proofing stages, that it felt like a bit of a forest myself going through it. So, that it's not, and we intended that, this is kind of, it's an expression of collective writing, lots of years of historical kind of research and archival work and thoughtfulness. And we want it to be thoughtful. We didn't want, to be involving ourselves in the hubris of giving some kind of solutions to things. That's what we wanted to avoid. And I think there's a tension in left publishing. One of the tensions is they need to sell books, and books that give solutions to things or have the final word that can be promoted that way. Often that's kind of can be attracted to publishing. We look to find an editor really that had our view on it and helped us create a book we wanted to create. But I do think what Mike was saying is right, that there needs to be alternative ways of producing work. Collective for us has always been the case through the publications we're involved in. Collective writing, expanding networks of writing around collective authorship and bridging divisions. I mean, I've been in academia before, but as a design teacher, not in this field. And I left really partly because of my mental health, but otherwise to write this book with Mike, because I wanted to commit to it. And there's people here, a lot of people here are in academia, and bridging between academia, people who are outside of it, and social movements, it seems to be incredibly important to us, because a lot of the work we rely on here is scholarship. And a lot of the attacks at the moment are on scholarship. And there's, it's really important, I think, to bridge alliances between people who are not in universities and are outside of them, but also universities as workplaces and places where, we need to kind of support knowledge, like they always call it knowledge transfer in university, don't they? But, a kind of like, what's a radical transfer of knowledge, a radical dialogue that can cut across those divisions. So we are interested in what that is, really.
Knowledge expropriation.
Yeah, knowledge expropriation. Yeah. So yeah. So yeah, that's my thoughts, I suppose.
Does anybody have any other question? Yes, we have a question from, just a thank you from Pardo and from Nilmini, who both very much appreciated the conversation. I mean, unless anybody has another question, I might abuse my position just to ask you something, because I mean, what you said there just at the end, Alex, about, the attacks on scholarship, which obviously many of us are feeling, but I think many people are also not, because I think one of the problems with universities and academics and the entire structure of the neoliberal academy is how people manage to shield themselves. And there's a lot of kind of fear that I think is a kind of a version of what, Charles Mills calls white ignorance, but it's more like, hear no evil, see no evil, speak no evil kind of thing. And not an academic's not necessarily standing in solidarity with people who are at the much pointier end of the state's attacks. And of course, there's overlap between who is under attack, and many people who also occupy particular identity positions. I'm thinking in particular of transgender people in the current moment are also academics. So we're not, I'm not trying to say that, we can split this out into neat groups, but just in terms of the arguments in the book and thinking about how things have very rapidly, escalated, I think, in the last, since you've finished publishing the book, is there anything that you think that you would want to add? Not saying that now you should write a sequel, but what are your thoughts on what the book, or rather what the book can inform us about the current attacks that we're experiencing?
Do you want to go on that, Mike? I feel like I'm talking.
You go first. I'm hoping that what you say will spur me.
Yeah, it has. It has. I feel a bit disoriented. I think we all do. I think everyone feels a bit disorientated. I think the speed of the escalations are frightening. I feel like there's a lot of there's not much capacity in a lot of people. Like I'm talking to a lot of time, I feel that myself, that we really need to build capacities up where people aren't jumping in and out of things and getting burnt out, but that we can kind of find a bit more sustainability around, kind of what an organizing pathway or resistance to these things are. I feel like, in terms of like the work, I do feel like the kind of work we were doing and the kind of collectivity of writing and researching a project like that, from writing the book and speaking to other people who've done reading groups around it, and speaking to others who've engaged with the work online that we then made contacts with, that we're interested in really just maintaining contact, bridging contacts, creating more contacts around a scholarship that can happen outside of the academy as well. And just by being in a room researching something together, you build an interpersonal strength and trust that can take you, into spaces, which are going to come up where you've got comrades, that kind of maintain those comradely relations becomes incredibly important, I think, at this point. Because there's a lot of sourness on the left, there's a lot of sense of urgency, there's a lot of disorientation. And I think trying to build, it seems like a very simple thing maybe, but to build kind of forms of care and self-care around comradely groups, and that can involve reading and learning and research, isn't it? That is a good way to do it. And so I'm very thinking a lot, I suppose, after the book about the form of the book's production and our histories around that in organizing and kind of like radical media collectives, that is becoming more important than ever to like make an argument for that, make a case for it, that it's not just a bunch of left-wing people getting in a room like it always was, these kind of stereotypes of like of left-wing culture, that it's kind of, we need to find ways where we can maintain relationships to each other and capacities in situations where there's a lot going on. So I it's a bit of a hazy answer, but that's what I'm thinking about a lot. And I don't feel incredibly confident, if I'm being completely honest, about what the next steps are. So I don't know if that helps you bounce off, Mike.
Oh, well, I'm sure I'm equally unconfident as you are. Yeah, I think I'm happy. I see Gloria Tabby's hand up, so I'm happy for that to be happy to take that.
Yeah, go ahead, Gloria.
Oh, okay. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much for Alex and Michael and the elimination on the identity politics. I really enjoyed that. I wish we've got more time to really dive into that more. So identity politics is purposely being dismissed as a viable way in the theorization of the power structure, and is used quite negatively, especially here in Australia. So in your research, I wanted to ask if you could speculate how we may use identity politics in the right way in the collective struggle and resistance. Thank you.
Thanks, Gloria. Yeah, I think it's interesting because I think when we were writing the book, Alex and I were often kind of going back and forth over whether is our project about trying to show the real identity politics and present it as like this thing that's like that has a settled meaning and that is really important to kind of all movement building. Because a big part of the book, or like a part of framing the book in the introduction and the conclusion, is about engaging with basically the discourse around identity politics, about what the term has come to mean over the course of like several decades of kind of pejorative uses and attacks on it. And so I think emerging out of that, like certainly in terms of the book, like part of our project was kind of trying to trace that kind of pejorative turn, and often find that like a lot of the kind of groundwork is often done by the left and then taken on like negative attacks by the left is then later taken on by the center and the right, and kind of and it changes form, but that's part of the kind of chronology often of it. And so I guess what I'm saying is in terms of answering your question is that I don't know that it's like the way that these discourses and the way that language works, I don't know whether it's a salvageable term, like to try to say, right, this is what identity politics is in 2023, after all these years of basically most people thinking that it's something else. Like our project was to say, this is where it came from. This is like the way that these are the attacks on it, and this is why we think it's happened. And it's largely because it was it's something that emerged, a term and an organizing practice that emerged from Black politics, and that there's a pattern to terms like wokeness, identity politics, cancelling that emerge from Black cultures and Black online cultures and Black forms of struggle that get appropriated and then kind of spat out on kind of onto larger scales. And so I kind of feel like people will continue to organize in autonomous ways against oppression and exploitation, and that people will develop their own terminologies, and probably those will also be appropriated and ruined. And that's kind of like the cycle, and that's what's more important is the forms of struggle that develop, and that I think is happening and does happen and will continue to. I just feel really bad for like for people like Barbara Smith from like the Combahee River Collective, who is like doing lots of work and stuff now, where she's just constantly having to field these kind of things about this term that she coined, that is based on the fact that they were like really intensely organizing around violence against Black women in Boston, which is what their group was doing, and how their practice formed. And then I saw recently she was in an online conversation with Robin D.G. Kelly and also Norman Finkelstein. And Finkelstein was just like, he has this thing where he wants to write this thing saying that isn't identity politics terrible, and he wanted to talk about Robin DiAngelo and she just like calmly kind of explains to him, this is like my life's work, I was involved in this is what we did. And he just wants to go back and talk about Robin DiAngelo because he has this idea that identity politics is the reason why the left is failing on this, that, and the other. And I just don't think that trying to kind of salvage the original term is actually the project. I think it's about always trying to kind of, people are always trying to form new modes of struggle, and they will have different names.
Really appreciate that. Thank you.
Professor Carlson, you have a question.
And thanks, Deb, for all that great commentary. And really interesting to listen. I haven't had a chance to read the book. I came to tonight's session to see if I'm inspired to read it, and I am. So,
oh, that's good.
I was interested in some of the things that you talked about, these networks of collectives and thinkers, and for Indigenous people here, the politics of identity is something that is a cross that we bear almost like on a daily, constant basis. And so one of the ways in which that logic that Deb spoke about in terms of my book, The Logic of Elimination, operates is through academia, and the way that we are not cited, our work is not engaged with, even though here on this continent, Indigenous people have been in the academy now for a few decades, not as long as other people. And so what I find is that people go to a black-white dichotomy constantly and draw on scholarship from Black scholars to kind of weigh and give some balance to white scholarship, and totally completely ignore Indigenous peoples. And you mentioned that you hadn't thought about including people from this end of the world. And I did have a chuckle at Deb's comment that that's interesting, given the history. And given the crazy monarchists and all the rest that we have here, and that we have to deal with the residue of that. So it would be really lovely to see, a couple of dudes in the academy engage with Indigenous people globally to bring forth their scholarship and to show the way in which it's useful to the world, not only to the Indigenous world. So that would be a really fun thing to see. Like, I often pick up books that are on topics that I've written extensively about and look to see if I'm ever cited, and it's never so. And when I'm cited, it's only as a side reference to Indigenous people are marginalized on digital platforms like Carlson. And I dare say that will be the same with my books I've written on colonial commemorations and monuments, and but I cite everyone who writes. And so I think that our genealogy and intellectual space is really, really important. And so I cite all key people in that space, but I find that what I'm seeing and what I'm reading, it's a very black-white issue. So that is white folk drawing on black folk only. And I do think, it's an interesting point if we talk about America. The Black Lives Matter movement is about police brutality against Black bodies, and that is a daily occurrence, just like it is here. But Native American people are actually killed by police at higher rates. Crickets chirping in the interest of that, and so I would like to see a couple of dudes who are doing pretty well and got some really important things to say, use those networks to include Indigenous people. I'm not sure if that's something that's on your agenda.
I think, well, I agree with everything you've said there. And I mean, I think for our own context, we're not in the academy. I think it's important to state that, that we aren't in it, but everything you've said, everything you've said maintains. And, one of the, I suppose, why we were trying to limit our analysis to the material we had and the historical scenes we developed around the UK and the US, because we felt that we could contribute in that setting. But I think certainly, when you read that, we're aware of those things you're talking about. What we didn't want to do, which I suppose could be another way of, or erase. Another way of erasure, I suppose, would be to incorporate Indigenous histories in a trivial way, as you talked about, in a way where you're not giving enough critical attention or what's sufficient. And I felt that what we did is try to follow a trace of social movement debates, which I think part of that, and what needs to be acknowledged, is that all the way back to the 19th century, what we understand is the progressive movements, there hasn't been any space for a critical engagement in indigeneity. Like, it's completely apparent. And so because that's apparent historically, I think it becomes potentially apparent within the book itself that we write, that we can't, the engagement there, we couldn't, we didn't want to bolt on something that we couldn't critically evaluate and give time to. So I think that's what I would say, but certainly I agree. And we're in lots of discussions with comrades and stuff where that's becoming more and more clear of an issue. Because if you think about the main issue of the time is environmentalism, it's suddenly a relationship to land, resources, everything, where critical indigenous studies has got the analysis there to kind of understand, and it's been ignored. And still in environmentalist movements, or in some parts of those movements, it's still ignored. So I don't know you were to add to that, Mike, but we're aware of this and discussed this, didn't we, as part of the
no, thanks, Bronwyn, for what you said. I mean, I certainly agree. I think fairly early on, it was kind of set that we were talking about the US and Britain, partly because they were the kind of terrains that we knew. Like my mother is American, but also because of the US being the kind of imperial hegemon, and us kind of receiving a lot of their discourses secondhand. So a lot of this stuff starts in America. Identity politics, wokeness, these things are produced in America. I think what I'm learning now is how much, how these things have their own different kind of forms, especially in other kind of other of Britain's other white settler colonies, historical settler colonies, and how those kind of things kind of develop. Like how I'm aware that like that there's those same attacks kind of exist within Australian media. We did like an event in Edinburgh, like, you know, there were even aspects of like how wokeness was used in Scotland that we didn't know just from being in England, and that's like very close. So it's like these things do have their important particularities, and you know, with covering the US, of course, we set it in the context of settler colonialism, and we're definitely not kind of insensitive to like Britain's historical role in the world. And like I think we discuss in the book the fact that Britain's own kind of in origins of immigration controls in against Jewish migrants in 1905 were like developed off the basis of its other settler colonies, including Australia. Like these are all kind of part of like shared histories, and it's true that we would have liked to have kind of covered more, and in terms of like having a more kind of like central kind of Indigenous lens, Indigenous critique from Indigenous scholars, that's definitely something that like is that we need to kind of like reflect on now, for like any kind of like future projects, because like, you know, even since writing the book, it's like I've been reading a lot more, and including reading a lot of Debbie stuff in preparation for this event, and kind of, and like that's definitely something that that we want to be part of, like working on going into the future. But yeah, like Alex said, like we kind of like we're quite kind of we're not particularly you know, big names or like active people. Like I mean, Alex is mostly snowed under, like with 2 kids, and like I've mostly been working temp jobs in a casino for the last couple of months. So like we're not high flying authors by any means.
And it wasn't a critique of this book. I was thinking when you were talking about collective networks and future work, and I understand the struggle I had. I came to uni in my late 30s with 4 kids in tow and working as a cleaner. So I understand that space. So, and even though you might not think that you're in the scholarly world, when you produce a piece of work that people are interested in, you're suddenly there. It was like, I was suddenly became there. So you are there, and here we are all engaging in your work, which is fabulous. So I do look forward to having a good solid read of it and seeing what you come up with next.
I look forward to reading your book as well.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you, Bronwyn, for that. I think that's really engaged, a super important discussion for us to kind of bring to a close our first seminar. And indeed, this kind of question is exactly the reason why we wanted to start this seminar series, and to have an opportunity not only for us here in so-called Australia to have the opportunity to listen to authors from elsewhere who've written on issues that are important to us, but also precisely to try to place this place in relation to the global conversation on race, where when I think about it, Australia can really be thought of as a laboratory for the racial colonial project on a global scale. And therefore, it's always so interesting and curious to me that it seems to slip by the wayside when, you know, we're having those global conversations. Of course, part of that is the lack of investment in race studies in this country. And I think, you know, we've still got a long way to go on that. And part of the way I think that we can be supported in our endeavor is through more people from elsewhere being aware of what we're struggling with and having these productive kind of dialogues. So on that note, I just want to thank Alex, Michael, and Debbie so much for this conversation, and all of you for coming this evening. And I'd like to now just turn to Eiling just to close us out.
Thank you everyone for attending today's seminar. This is just the first. We still have 5 more for the rest of the year. We would like to invite you to attend our next seminar on Organized Fight Win, Black Communist Women's Political Writing. That will be on the 10th of May, and I'm just going to leave the Eventbrite link on the chat. Feel free to register, and we hope to see you at our next seminar. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you, Alex, Michael, and Debbie, for such a wonderful conversation. And thank you everybody for your questions.